Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet another lore video, although this one is going to be a bit unusual since it will be the first lore video I do that is not Warhammer nor 40k. I have been talking about starting up some new series for a while, and we will start with one of everyone's favourite franchises, Star Wars. Now, of course, I will be doing my personal take on this, so if you are a huge fan of Star Wars and do not wish to see the universe criticised, this is probably not going to be for you. So, with that out of the way, let's start with some groundwork. It is important, first and foremost, to note that Star Wars was never intended to be the cultural phenomenon it became. Even George Lucas himself had no idea how massive the Star Wars franchise would become, and as such it was never designed from the ground up to be an internally consistent universe. Indeed, many of the famous weapons were based on World War II props that were cheap and easy to get a hold of. And this, of course, is one of the primary reasons why the movies often have glaring inconsistencies. In fact, you could probably go so far as to say that the only consistent thing in Star Wars is the inconsistencies. Let's take an example from the latest Rogue One movie, for example, where fully armoured stormtroopers get mowed down by single blaster hits like the third-rate movie henchmen that they are, while the main bad guy takes a blaster shot directly to the shoulder while wearing nothing more than a thick woolen sweater and barely fucking flinches. And, I mean, it's not that he just doesn't get killed, he seems to barely even notice. It doesn't even seem like a small inconvenience to him. However, the next time he gets shot in the shoulder near the end of the movie, it's going to instantaneously kill his poor little ass. But at the same time, inconsistencies notwithstanding, the movies cannot simply be ignored as they undeniably make up the crux of the Star Wars franchise. As such, I will be using lore from both the movies and from the various fan sites. I'll be using fan sites simply because they can be relied upon to give the universe a fair shake. There is no one more likely to give a universe a positive review, after all, than someone that is a fan of the universe, and of course I will be using schematics of the weapons whenever I can get a hold of them. And lastly, the video will be divided into two segments. The first will be the pure fluff segment, and the second segment will be where I try to figure out how the bloody hell anyone could possibly think that any of this shit would make any goddamn sense in any fucking universe. Never mind one that seems to be having so much in common with our own. And so, finally, without further ado, let us get into the blaster weapons, shall we? We'll start with the term blaster. As you might have probably noticed if you have any experience with the Star Wars franchise whatsoever, blaster is a catch-all term that literally means anything that looks vaguely like a rifle, pistol, carbine, sniper rifle, or any other sort of weapon that produces a pew-pew noise. One can ask oneself what manner of gormless idiot decided that we didn't need any quick and simple way of differentiating pistols, rifles, and machine guns from one another, but, oh well, details. Or actually, you know what? No, not details. The Star Wars universe has heavy machine guns, it has emplacement weaponry, it has anti-tank cannons, it's got sniper weapons, it's got carbines, it's got rifles, it's got pistols. Referring to all of them as blasters would be like the modern militaries of the world all agreeing to stop referring to the various weapons based on their true proper designations like rifles, machine guns, submachine guns, etc., and simply just referring to the entire goddamn arsenal as gunpowder weapons. Which, while technically correct, gives you absolutely no goddamn information about what it is you're actually talking about. And it is due to this rather ridiculous goddamn limitation that I will be concentrating on a couple of the more famous blasters, the E11 and the DC-15A. And we'll start with the DC-15A. This was the weapon that was the primary small arm of the Republic's clone trooper armies during the first three movies, and it had a couple of minor variations. Generally speaking, the most commonly used was the carbine version that cut down on the weapon's rather considerable length and weight. This thing weighs in at almost 10 kilograms, which is pretty goddamn heavy for a small arm. Interestingly enough, the DC-15A is also one of the few blasters that actually fire plasma projectile. A thing that you will notice quite early on in the various Star Wars lore is that they refute the claim that the blasters are laser weaponry, despite the fact that later on we will see that, yes, they are, but technically not. I'll get into that later. Anyways, the DC-15A actually fires a plasma bolt, which is rather rare. The E-11, for example, does not actually fire a plasma projectile. However, this one does. And the way it creates this plasma is actually rather ingenious. Basically, the weapon has two primary components that it uses to produce the plasma ammunition. Firstly, there is a container of high-energy gas that is located near the back end of the weapon. This contains enough gas for about 500 shots. Additionally, the weapon has a so-called charge pack, which is the little thing that looks like a standard rifle magazine. What happens is that a small measure of gas is released into the arming chamber, quote-unquote, and is then ionized via the charge pack. This is actually quite brilliant because it does not require the chamber itself to be heated up or be pressurized in such a way as to create the necessary heat to turn solid matter into plasma. Plasma, as you all probably know, is simply ionized gas. And by ionizing the gas directly, plasma is created without all of the hassle that would normally surround the procedure to create a plasma bolt. Said bolt is then fired from the weapon via electromagnets, which is a bit of an oddity just looking at the weapon, but we'll get into that in a bit. Now, as for specifications, as previously mentioned, the weapon has a charged capacity of 500 rounds. However, it is only the gas that is enough for 500 rounds. The charge magazine only contains enough charge for 50 rounds. And of course, without the ionizing potential of the charge pack, plasma cannot be created, which means that the weapon actually needs to be reloaded quite regularly. However, slapping in a new charge pack is a fairly simple operation, requiring the simple removal of the old charge pack, just like a standard magazine, and the slotting in of a fresh charge pack. The removal of the gas container, however, can be quite complicated. On the DC-15A, you have to break open the back of the weapon, kind of like you would an old-school breech-loaded rifle. Pull out the gas tube and then replace it with a new one. Additionally, these gas containers are relatively heavy and quite large, which means that carrying several of them is not particularly practical. However, with a capacity of 500 rounds per container, this is not a huge problem. And veteran clone troopers could probably be expected to bring with them as many of these gas canisters as well as charge packs that they could possibly carry, simply because while 500 rounds might sound like a lot, and indeed it is a fair bit, but when you are fighting against an enemy that is literally mass-produced in the case of the droid armies, it's actually not such an overwhelming amount of firepower. And when you take into consideration that there does not appear to be any way of recharging the power packs under battlefield conditions, this makes them even more important. While an Imperial las rifle might be able to be recharged via simply just putting it on the lip of a trench and allowing it to recharge directly from sunlight, or even just via directed heat energy in the case of a bonfire, if a clone trooper runs out of power cells, he's boned, and as such, you want to be bringing a lot of those little bastards. However, one has to assume that the various vehicles used by the Republican Army would contain some way of charging these power cells, and this would be especially important during lengthy engagements, simply because the gas itself and the power charge packs are relatively large, and supplying large quantities of these to the front lines would be an absolute hassle, at which point the clone troopers would probably be better off using good old-fashioned projectile weapons, since they would be, in most cases, lighter, more compact, and easier to transport in large quantities, rather than unstable gas and charged power packs. This overly complicated supply situation might, however, be made up for by the sheer destructive power of the weapon itself. According to the fluff, a single hit from one of these weapons is capable of blasting a half-a-meter hole in ferrocrete, which I'm going to be assuming is at least as strong as concrete or reinforced concrete, simply because ferrocrete, concrete, classic sci-fi nonsense. And let me assure you, this is an absolutely ludicrous amount of destructive potential from a heat-based weaponry. We'll be getting into exactly how insanely powerful this would have to be later on, but trust me, this is absurdly powerful. And additionally, the weapon has a maximum range of 10 kilometers. No, you didn't hear me wrong. 10 kilometers. Now, again, how exactly this is achieved with a weapon that fires a projectile that moves so slowly is far beyond my limited imagination, but oh well. But what really intrigues me with this is, why would you want a small arm with a range of 10 kilometers? How would you possibly utilize this absolutely batshit insane range? I mean, you can't even see a target at 10 kilometers, much less hit it. Not to mention the fact that since this is of course a solid projectile, plasma, for those of you who do not know, acts like a liquid. It is not light, nor is it gas. It is a solid projectile, and it is going to have weight. As such, it is going to have fall-off, which means that if you are going to try and hit something at 10 kilometers, you are going to need targeting computers usually reserved for goddamn artillery. And that is not by any means a figure of speech. The magical DC-15 has range comparable to that of the M101A 105mm howitzer. Not to mention, it has this range despite having a muzzle velocity of what looks like maybe 100 to 200 meters per second, whereas the M101 has a muzzle velocity close to 500 meters per second. To put it bluntly, the DC-15A is so magical that it makes a posh British mage manatee riding a broomstick while fighting pigeon cats with a revolver look like a low fantasy setting. And all that is before we get into how the hell a weapon that looks like that with no apparent cooling can manage to fire plasma bolts. But oh well, we'll get to that in the could it possibly goddamn work section. For now, let's move on to a far more plausible weapon, the E11 Blaster Carbine. And I'll tell you this much, after the magic that was the DC-15A, the E11 came as a very positive surprise. It is a Star Wars weapon that not only is relatively plausible, but it would even make sense from a battlefield and logistical perspective. Granted, I still have absolutely no explanation for why the bolt is so ridiculously slow, but oh well, it is Star Wars after all. And while we're on that subject, I also have no idea why on God's good green earth the Star Wars fluff has decided that the E11 is supposedly even more destructive than the DC-15A, which is quite the feat considering that the fluff for the DC-15A claims it has about the same effect on target as a 203mm naval shell. You know, I've always found it somewhat amusing that people keep complaining that 40k is too overpowered when according to the pure fluff, Star Wars handheld weaponry have more destructive potential than a Warhound Titan. But oh well, we'll be getting to what kind of damage a weapon like this could actually feasibly put out in the would it possibly work section. But before then, let's just have a general look at the E11 Blaster Rifle, or Blaster Carbine, technically speaking. First and foremost, it is immediately and obviously a better weapon than the DC-15A for the vast majority of combat situations. And again, this is somewhat based on the origins of Star Wars and how back in the day, when they had no idea if this was going to be a success or just another dime a dozen action movies, they had to get their props wherever they could find them. As such, the E11 Blaster Rifle was based off the British Sterling submachine gun, which itself was essentially just a desperate attempt to cobble together whatever piece of piping was left on the British Isles after the British suddenly realised, oh my god, having single soldiers be able to put out 30 rounds in about 5 seconds is actually pretty damn useful in modern warfare. Who'da thunk? Funny side note, by the way, back in that time, when the Germans were developing, you know, MG34s, 42s, and MP40s to increase the firepower of the squads, the British were still clinging to the idea that their men could simply form rank formations and volley fire the enemy to death. Ah, warfare. You're so silly. But let's get back on the point of the handheld super bazookas before I wander off on a tangent about British idiocy in the Second World War. And so, as mentioned, the E11 was based on the Sterling submachine gun, while the DC-15A was based on the MG-34. Now, as anyone with even the slightest inclination as to how combat or even just modern weapons work in general would be able to tell you, having a massive fuck-off rifle that weighs in at somewhere along the lines of 10 kilograms is a really goddamn bad idea. And God help you if you were ever expected to carry that unusually stupid piece of piping into a close-quarters situation. Just imagine trying to use that unnecessarily long piece of stovepipe inside of a house. The enemy would see your unnecessarily long gun poking its way around a corner 5 minutes before the rest of you arrive. And assuming that the entrepreneuring bad guy is enough of a good sport to simply wait while the rest of you and your ridiculously large gun clears the corner, all he has to do to avoid getting a load of plasma to the face is stand within half a goddamn meter to completely neutralize your weapon. And while granted, the DC-15 does look like it would make for an excellent club, I know of very few soldiers that would go like, yeah, this weapon is perfectly fine, I can't use it to fire much, but it's pretty damn hefty and I can bash people above the head with it. Luckily, the E11 is not a half-a-meter long piece of worthless piping, and therefore solves most of the initial problems for the DC-15A, including its weight. While the DC-15 weighs in at something along the lines of 10 kilograms, this far more handy weapon weighs in at a mere 3 kilograms. This does come at the expense of a smaller gas containment chamber and a somewhat weaker power charge pack, which means that the power charge pack and the gas chamber will both need to be replaced more often, but we are still talking about a solid 200 rounds from the gas pack and 30 to 40 from the power charge pack before you really need to worry about it. And coupled with the smaller size of the weapon, this will mean that it is considerably easier to bring more of these charge packs into battle compared to the considerably bulkier versions found in the DC-15. But perhaps the biggest improvement is the different ways they actually use the high-energy gas, which is the common MacGuffin in this sort of scenario. Instead of being turned into a plasma-based weapon, the high-energy gas is charged in the same way by ionizing the particles, and then the plasma is essentially detonated to create a stream of positively latent ions. Now, this does have a pretty damn huge problem, which I'll be getting into later, but technically speaking, this is a damn good idea. A directed ion weapon would be fantastically useful. Although granted, it has one major weakness. The main advantage of a charged particle weapon is kinetical force. The charged particles will create a far greater amount of kinetic energy than the base material. Let's put together a relatively simple example. Let's say that you have an energy source that is capable of producing something along the lines of 20 kilograms of kinetic force, just pulling numbers out of my ass here. If you manage to turn this propulsion material into an ionized stream, you would be able to increase the velocity of that force by an absolutely ludicrous amount. In fact, ionized energy, as far as we have been able to determine so far via things like the Large Hadron Collider, moves at close to the speed of light, and as we all know, the total kinetic energy of an object is primarily based upon its own weight and the speed at which it is traveling, which means that a 20 kilogram force traveling at the speed of light will have one incredible impact, making it a fantastically effective kinetic weapon. This does, however, mean that the weapon is entirely reliant on pure kinetic energy for its damage, which is perfectly fine if you're shooting against soft, organic targets, because the sheer trauma of the impact will be more than enough to shatter bones and rupture internal organs, making it an incredibly effective weapon. However, if you have shock-absorbent material, or a material that in any way is capable of reducing the kinetic impact by giving way, thereby decreasing both the kinetic energy and the velocity of the ionized stream, the overall effect will be drastically reduced. And once you have decreased the energy to a certain point, you are left with a good old-fashioned kinetic weapon. And the problem with kinetic weapons is that they will try to take the easiest path, which means that it will glance off curved surfaces, etc. There's also a couple inherent problems with using positively charged ions as a weapon, but those have more to do with the firing mechanism, e.g. the E11 blaster, than the idea of using charged particles as a weapon, so we'll be getting into that in the how the hell would it actually work section instead. But basically, the E11's grounding concepts are solid. It's a small weapon with a relatively generous ammo capacity that's not too hard to resupply, and develops a huge amount of kinetic energy. Now, again, this is not consistent with what we see in the movies, by any stretch of the imagination, nor the extended universe novels for that matter, which is probably the most infuriating part, since it really does seem like a lot of this weapon lore was simply written from the perspective of a fanboy going, I'm just going to want to have this be more powerful and to sound cooler. What's awesome? Oh, I know, charged ion particles fired in a beam. That sounds Star Warsy. Yes, it does, but it also does not produce a weapon that does what this weapon is supposed to do, and it has some other inherent problems, but oh well. If, however, we choose to simply ignore all of these little niggling issues, we arrive at a pretty damn effective weapon. The E11 blaster is actually one of very few weapons in Star Wars that I would actually consider to take into battle, but for one small problem. Namely the fact that the projectiles fired by this weapon defy all laws of the physical universe by dragging its glowing red ass across the screen at a speed that would be considered shameful by a turtle with a lifelong addiction to horse tranquilizers. And this is by far the biggest military problem the Star Wars universe faces at any one point. Even if we were to accept at face value the nuclear levels of destructions that these weapons supposedly are capable of, it is all rendered moot and pointless with the simple fact that the incandescent bolts of lol bang travel at a speed comparable to a lethargic sloth who has recently been bopped across the head with a heavy piece of industrialized metal. Indeed, this complete and utter lack of haste or urgency in any shape and or form means that the devastating waffle energy of the blaster bolts can be avoided by calmly and considerately stepping out of the way. A feat that can be achieved even by a club-footed mouth breather with a long history of sedative abuse and repeated bouts of broken leg syndrome. In fact, the boom bolts are so slow that even a 111-year-old hermite, who undoubtedly was the proud owner of a wide variety of age-related ails and brittle bones disease, could confidently bat them aside with his glowing green beat stick. How, precisely, you're supposed to be able to deflect a beam of ion particles with their insane kinetic energy via the aid of a glow stick is beyond my limited comprehension, but oh well, it is what it is. And you might be thinking, wow, Art, you're making a fucking meal out of this, and yes, I am, because this is the one thing that makes the blaster weapons goddamn worthless on the battlefield. In all due essentiality, an E11 blaster, or the DC-15 for that matter, would have a maximum effective range of something along the lines of 60 to 100 meters, because at anything above those ranges, the target would have a solid 1 to 2 seconds to simply step out of the goddamn way. And if said target is shooting something back at you with a muzzle velocity of 4 to 500 meters per second, you're just gonna be fucked. And in all due honesty, there is absolutely no goddamn reason why the Star Wars universe shouldn't just go back to using good old-fashioned goddamn projectile weapons, as even the humblest of rifles would be more effective on an actual battlefield than these blaster thingamajigs. But still, assuming everyone else in the universe is very sportsmanlike and everyone has agreed to use the same useless style of weaponry, which appears to be the case, then the E11 blaster is probably your best bet. And it is precisely because the E11 actually makes some kind of sense that we will of course be starting with the DC-15, when I'm going to be just ragging on about how the shit would not bloody function, and the DC-15 is most definitively a very good example of that particular part. Right then, let's first look at the plasma-based weapon then, the DC-15A. As previously mentioned, the weapon uses some sort of magical thingamabob gas that is stored in a container at the rear end of the weapon, and is released into the arming chamber, where it is ionized via the charging pack and turned into plasma. Okay, so far, so good. This is a relatively plausible way both to store and to create plasma ammunition, but now we immediately have a problem, namely how to fire the plasma. Again, the fluff claims it uses electromagnetical means to do so, which makes sense because you want to be keeping the plasma out of direct contact with the weapon at all cost, otherwise the weapon is going to be turning into string cheese. The problem, however, is that there are no apparent magnetic rails on the weapon, nor is there any sign of a power source for this electromagnetical rail, and to accelerate a blob of plasma to even the modest speeds seen in Star Wars, it would require a fairly considerable amount of power. But one problem at a time. Let's start with the magnetic rails. The weapon would have to have a magnetic rail system spanning all 360 degrees of the weapon's barrel to prevent the plasma from leaking out of it. Basically, the magnets create a safe space, or a force field of some sorts, to contain the plasma, pressing in on it from all directions at the same time to keep it levitated perfectly in the center of the weapon without touching any of the melty parts. On the DC-15, said rail would have to be inside the barrel, but judging by the size of the barrel and the projectile created, that seems rather unlikely, as it would mean the magnetic rail would practically be in direct contact with the plasma, and I don't really need to tell you how bad an idea it would be to have a plasma weapon's main source of propulsion melting from the heat. And that of course assumes that they can even make magnets that powerful and that small without a cooling system to increase the conductivity of the electromagnet. Star Wars would need a metal with a much greater level of magnetic potential than modern supermagnets made from iron, neodymium, boron alloys, and said metal would have to be common and therefore cheap enough to be used in infantry small arms. Basically what I'm saying is that it's extremely unlikely for this to be the case, as with these circumstances in existence, rail weapons would almost certainly have been a vastly superior choice to blasters. And as for the power source, it would have to be pretty dang considerable, as the weapon is expected to operate for 500 or so shots with the magnets in constant operation. And yet the only thing that could possibly be a power pack of some sort is the thing at the bottom here, which appears to be used primarily as a handhold and seems damn small for the task in question. There's also this rail thing up here, which is apparently used to house the weapon's circuitry that lets the weapon connect to the trooper's helmet. And, by the way, it is a remarkably bad idea to put sensitive electronics right above a plasma weapon's barrel. It is without doubt the warmest place you could possibly put it, and even more so due to the DC-15's apparent complete and utter lack of a cooling system, or even hell, just fucking cooling vents for that matter. All I can tell you is that the circuitry in said targeting system had better well be fucking made out of diamonds. And that brings us quite neatly to the third problem. In the fluff, the weapon is stated to be able to blast a half-a-meter hole in ferrocrete. Now, as previously mentioned, for the purpose of this video, I'll simply assume that ferrocrete is a fantasy name for concrete, except better. So probably something along the lines of reinforced concrete. With that in mind, what would we need to blast a half-a-meter hole in it? Well, you would need something along the lines of a 150mm howitzer shell. But considering the fact that droids hit with said blasters do not explode into tiny little metal bits, we can safely assume that it doesn't have that kind of explosive potential, which leaves us with heat. It is a plasma weapon, after all. And as many of you probably know, concrete doesn't melt per se, but it can be turned molten if exposed to direct temperatures in excess of 1000 degrees Celsius. But to explosively blast a half-meter hole in a wall, you would need many times that. Probably something along the lines of 30 to 40,000 degrees, delivered virtually instantaneously. And again, this is to just blast a hole in the wall. Melting it would require considerably lesser temperatures, but it would also be inconsistent with the force that the fluff claims the weapon is capable of. And as for the 30 to 40,000 degrees Celsius temperature, well, we know that lightning strikes in our world can come up to 30 to 36 to 40,000 degrees, and they have been known to crack open concrete. As such, it seems to be a reasonably rough estimate, but of course it is by no means a definite number. But the basic point is that the DC-15 would have to be able to produce and contain temperatures that a weapon that looks like that simply could not feasibly do. I mean, think of the very most basic problem. This is a weapon that is expected to generate something along the lines of 30,000 degrees Celsius, and yet it has no apparent cooling systems whatsoever. There is practically no way this could possibly function. Even if the entire weapon was created out of goddamn diamonds, you'd be lucky to get 1, maybe 2 shots off before it was running through the clone trooper's hand like so much cotton candy placed inside of a furnace. So when it comes to that damage potential, we're probably going to have to notch that one up to movie magic and fanboy enthusiasm. But shall we try and figure out what kind of damage this weapon actually could do? The damage shown in the movies vary from far too little to far too much. For example, blasting a half-a-meter hole in a concrete wall is insanity. But leaving mere scorch marks on battle droids is pathetic for a weapon that supposedly fires bolts of concentrated plasma. Judging by the actual damage the weapon does, it looks like it's a relatively low-powered laser weapon, roughly comparable to the Imperial lasgun. But this is also a bit of an impossibility, because at that temperature the plasma would return to being gas. The projectile would have to be at least 2,000 to 3,000 degrees Celsius, and would likely be twice that. And yet, there's no way a weapon that looks like the DC-15A could possibly handle that sort of heat, as again, it has nothing in the way of cooling systems and no apparent electromagnetic rails. Indeed, the fluff itself states that the plasma is concentrated into a bolt due to the narrowness of the barrel, which suggests that the plasma bolt, which I remind you is going to be ranging from 2,000 to 6,000 degrees Celsius, has to be in direct contact with the barrel. This is a very, very bad idea. As even if the weapon was made from a material that could handle this temperature, and such weapons do exist, if the weapon was made out of carbon, for example, it would have a melting temperature of 3,600 degrees Celsius, but after repeated firings, that heat would start building up, especially as there appears to be no way of venting the goddamn weapon, which seems like the most ridiculous oversight in movie fucking history. Which brings us to an interesting little point, because of course Star Wars is a science fiction universe, or to be honest, I prefer to call it a fantasy fiction universe, because most of it is just that, fantasy fiction rather than science fiction. But let us entertain a little bit of an idea, shall we? Let us say that somewhere in the Star Wars universe there is a material with a considerably higher melting point than carbon, which would be able to resist the temperatures without the need for a cooling system. But here's the problem with that idea. If we assume that such a material is accessible, e.g. in a material that is capable of handling the temperatures of a plasma weapon without any real chance of melting, and it is widely available enough to be used in all small arms production, bear in mind that the entire barrel of the weapon would pretty much have to be constructed out of this stuff for it to make any goddamn sense and to make any real difference, you're going to have to come to the conclusion that said material is ridiculously common, and therefore is also very, very cheap. At that point, why don't people create body armor from this material? After all, making body armor from this material would almost undoubtedly be far easier than creating weapons out of it. As I am sure you are all aware, creating, for example, a rifle actually creates quite a lot of material spillage as you machine out the various parts of the weapon. However, creating something as simple as a cuirass, for example, would be a relatively simple procedure, and certainly far easier than producing a fully functioning weapon. And at that point, you have a suit of armor capable of resisting or dissipating the temperatures that the plasma bolts can produce, while also being easier and cheaper to produce. You've essentially made the weapon entirely pointless, as there's very little kinetic energy stored in this plasma bolt. After all, this is not a focused ion beam. This is simply just a globulet of plasma being fired at what appears to be, if I'm going to be generous again, 100 meters per second. And considering the small size of the plasma projectiles, therefore the relative lack of mass, it would appear as if getting hit by one of these plasma bolts, assuming you are capable of dissipating the heat, is going to be about the same as getting hit by a fastball from a good baseball pitcher. Granted, it's going to sting, but it's definitely not going to be killing you anytime soon. So with all this in mind, I honestly have to come to the conclusion that the DC-15A is a literal impossibility. It is a remarkably poorly designed weapon, all in all. It doesn't have any cooling, the circuitry is in a position that makes absolutely no sense, the ammunition being plasma-based, and yet being constructed like this is utterly ridiculous. You would think that anyone who was going out to create a weapon would instantaneously realize, oh, I'm going to have this be a plasma weapon, which means it fires projectiles of several thousand degrees Celsius. Perhaps I shouldn't have it actually touching the goddamn barrel. But no. Those thoughts apparently did not pass through the mind of whoever designed this godforsaken thing. So let us move swiftly on past the rotting corpse of the soon-to-be-forgotten DC-15 and actually look at the E-11, which is a weapon that actually kinda made a little bit of sense once you looked at it. So let's start with the part that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The idea that the weapon fires a stream, or beam if you so wish, of ionized particles. This idea has quite a lot of problems, but let us begin with the biggest of the lot. As many of you probably already know from your times as ratty-faced children playing with magnets, you will know that if you take one magnet and you try to push another magnet against it, the two magnets will repulse each other if you push the positive side against the other positive side, and this is exactly what happens in a beam of positively charged ions. The positively charged ions will continuously be trying to repel one another. And what happens when every single ion in a beam is continuously trying to push itself further away from all of the other ions? Ding 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 ding, that is exactly right. It dissipates into a harmless flash of light and a tiny bit of heated gas. So how could you possibly fix this? Well, there is no mention in the E-11 blast rifle on how it fixes it, so I'm going to pretty much assume that the weapon simply wouldn't function as stated in the lore, because this is the thing. We have created functioning ion beams on Earth, and we do this by taking the ion beam, which is continuously trying to repel each other, and surrounding it by a more powerful magnetic field. Basically, what happens is, when the ions are trying to push away from each other, they then run into a more powerful magnetic wall and is then pushed together again, which results in a relatively stable beam. However, since the E-11 blaster does not build a tunnel to its victim before the blaster round hits, we can pretty much assume that this is a no-go scenario. And additionally, we have to look upon the actual effect that the weapon has on enemies. In the Star Wars movies, as we have all seen, a blaster weapon doesn't do a whole lot to a humanoid target, except somehow killing it. However, with the sheer amount of kinetic energy that a weapon like this would deliver, it would turn an Imperial Stormtrooper into a fine red mist. Because, once again, whatever little matter, whatever little energy was garnered from the gas would have been accelerated at nearly the speed of light. This would be like hitting a human with a wrecking ball travelling at Mach 11. Oh, and of course there is one further teensy-weensy little problem, namely the fact that a weapon like this would require absurd amounts of energy, absolutely incredible amounts, not just to ionize the beam itself, but to contain it. The magnetic field required to actually make this into a weapon is insane. Like I mentioned, we have functioning versions on Earth today, but to even have the faintest hope of weaponizing these would require a portable nuclear power plant. And again, you might make the Star Wars argument is a science fiction thing and simply say, oh, you don't know how much power is in the charge packs. And that is true. I don't know how much power is in the charge packs. However, I can tell you this. If one of those tiny little charge packs is capable of generating enough electricity to power a goddamn city, there's absolutely no reason why there should be any form of conflict in this universe. There should literally be infinite energy available for everyone. And as history has proven time and time again, the fatter, the safer, and the richer a society gets, the less likely it is to start blowing shit up. And if the Star Wars universe had this kind of power available to them, it would literally be a universe of infinite energy. There would be no need for poverty. Nothing. You could create everything out of nothing, because you have literally infinite power. So we're going to have to go with the conclusion that no, the weapon does not fire an ion beam. That's just literally not the case. It wouldn't be possible, and if it was possible, there would literally be no reason for goddamn weapons. So, what could it potentially fire? Well, here's an interesting little idea, because the way that the weapon's actions are described are a little bit interesting. It simply claims to be firing an ionized beam, however, I have an alternative take on it. So the process begins by taking a small amount of gas, introducing it into an arming chamber, and then ionizing it, thereby turning it into plasma. Okay, now how about if you detonate that small globulate of plasma? Now, naturally, this would require the firing chamber to be coated entirely in carbon, but that's a fairly small amount of carbon, and it would be a relatively small explosion. Essentially, what you're trying to create here is a very, very small blast that creates intense heat energy, e.g. light. Now, the heat will be absorbed and dissipated by the carbon, but the light will be focused through a focusing array and directed out the front. Essentially, what you have created here is a remarkably high-powered laser weapon. Let us compare for a moment to the lasgun of 40K. It fires a laser bolt around 200 to 500 degrees Celsius, depending on the power setting and the pattern of the las weapon. Now, this is more than enough to kill a normal human. In fact, if it would hit an unprotected human, it would instantaneously boil the blood and fat in somebody's bodies, which would be more than enough to blow a limb up, for example. However, if the Star Wars blaster would be working off this same idea, using a small piece of plasma to produce the energy, the resulting laser bolt would almost certainly be considerably hotter, probably in the range of thousands plus degrees. Now, this makes it very effective against armor, something that the Imperial lasgun has a problem with. Because, as you see in Star Wars movies, and this is the odd thing again, because you can hit a named character and it'll do absolutely nothing when it should be detonating them like goddamn raspberries, but that's besides the point. I can't explain the speed of the blaster bolt either, so let's just skip that for the moment. It would explain why Stormtrooper armor is so ineffective. Essentially, Stormtrooper armor is made to be ballistic plating. It is there to absorb a kinetic impact, like, for example, bullets. However, this laser bolt doesn't do that. It strikes a small piece of the armor with incredibly high temperatures, which melts through virtually instantaneously a piece of the armor, but even if it didn't do that, the heat itself would superheat the flesh beneath the armor, which would cause the miniature explosion as fat and blood instantaneously boils. This would, as you can probably guess, introduce remarkable amounts of trauma onto the human body. In fact, it would be almost guaranteed to be an instant kill, even if you don't hit anything vital, as your body goes into shock of all of the pain and the trauma inflicted upon it. And if you hit an area close to the heart, or lungs, or kidneys, or, for God's sake, head, that would be an instantaneous kill, as you would literally be exploding major organs. And if you hit the stomach, oh God, all of that relatively low boiling point liquids that you have in your stomach, oh heavens, that would probably be the messiest way you could possibly die in the Star Wars universe. Granted, this should also mean that when a Stormtrooper gets hit by this, he should balloon out for a split second before falling to the ground like a loosely destroyed sack of flesh and boiled bones, but it is a Disney franchise after all, so what can you expect? But honestly though, I actually kinda like this idea, because clearly these charge packs do pack a considerable punch, being able to ionize gas so easily, and in this case, if you just took a tiny little smidgen and detonated it, producing temperatures well within tolerances of carbon, you could produce an incredibly powerful, focused beam of light. And in fact, they would be way more effective than the current blaster weapons, since of course a beam of focused light would be travelling at dun-dun-dun-dun, the speed of light. Now, true, it would still struggle with properly heavy armor. For example, it wouldn't be much more effective against ceramite armor than lasguns, since this is simply just too much and too energy-absorbent plating, but it would be absolutely devastating against infantry or lightly armored troops. An Imperial flak jacket, for example, would provide zero goddamn protection against this. And that's not even mentioning the considerable potential this would have as a terror weapon. I mean, think about this. The stormtroopers you see in the later Star Wars series under the command of Darth Vader is essentially a terrorizing organization. They rely upon their reputation as fearsome warriors, as a horrifying force of death and destruction to keep all of them in line, because there's not that many of them, and they certainly can't garrison every single world, and especially not when the Emperor is spending untold quadrillion, billions, dodillion, facillion, millions of credits on completely fucking worthless Death Stars that do precisely nothing before being blown up by rebels. I mean, for fuck's sake. Imagine if they'd used all of that money on just making more stormtroopers. You'd literally have a white armored clone standing behind every single dude in the galaxy, just whispering softly into his ear, "Don't betray the Emperor. Don't betray the Emperor or I'll fucking shoot you." That'd be way more fucking effective. But back to the point, if you simply shoot someone, that can be a noble death, die young and leave a handsome corpse and all that. That could possibly be used as a martyr, oh, he died for the cause, he died for freedom, all of that. But if you get hit by one of these things, there's not going to be a lot of a corpse left. There's going to be a horribly mangled and desecrated piece of flesh at best, maybe some gooey stuff that you could scrape off a wall. If that isn't going to take the fucking courage out of your mates, I don't know what is. And while there still are some niggling problems with the E11 as well, like for example the fact that the heat vents, the places where the superheated gas is supposed to escape so as to not overheat the barrel, is placed exactly where the Stormtrooper is expected to have his fucking hands. But still, I actually kind of like the E11, partially because it was created from a Sten gun, which was also just a piece of shit cobbled together at the last moment, which seems somewhat fitting, everything considered. And on that note, I will wrap up the first of the Star Wars lore rant videos. As you probably already noticed, they will undoubtedly be a little bit more ranty than the 40k and Warhammer stuff, simply because Star Wars does not make a whole lot of sense. When you're looking at Warhammer or 40k, you can be relatively certain that it's going to make a decent amount of sense according to the internal logic of the universe, but with Star Wars, well, that's not quite as much of the case. Nevertheless, I do hope you found this amusing, and please do leave any tips or ideas or, general guidance you might have down in the comments. I'm interested in hearing what you guys think about this slightly more humorous type of lore video. I will be doing other series, as I mentioned previously, but they will probably be a little bit more serious. For example, I am still looking at doing some Game of Thrones stuff because I kind of like that universe, and it makes way more sense. Hell, Game of Thrones is probably one of the more realistic fantasy universes out there, so I'm definitely looking into that. But that's enough for now. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.